If your child is going through the autism assessment process, it can be a lot to process and a lot to do, so much to navigate and quite stressful, if I'm honest. In today's episode of the Real Talk with Rhi podcast, I'm going to talk to you about the very first time that my family went through this process. It was with our second child, our youngest son. And honestly, I learned so much from this whole process. And if it hadn't been for the experience going through the autism assessment journey with William, who's the child in question, then I'm pretty sure none of my other children would have ever been diagnosed. And of my 4 children, all 4 have been assessed and all 4 have been diagnosed with autism. And really, it's this very long, drawn out journey that I went on with William that led to ultimately being able to understand all of my children better and get them any support that they need so that they can flourish and thrive, which I'm pleased to say I feel that they all are doing now. So if you're new around here, hello. My name's Rhiannon Morgan. Welcome to the Real Talk with Rhi podcast. Thanks for coming to hang out with me. Please do share your experiences as we go through this episode down in the comments. If you're watching here on YouTube, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, you can head to YouTube to continue the discussion or join me inside of my Patreon community. All the details will be found below. There is a forever free tier to get you started. You can hang out with like-minded mums and other parents who are going through this process as well, so we can support each other, because ultimately that is what we all need as parents of neurodiverse children. When we're having to fight to get them the assessments and the help they need, we need support, and for that we have each other. So hang out with me a little bit more inside of there. I also have a resource for you that I really wish someone had given me. I'll explain why as we go through the episode, but I have a PDF of 100 different signs of autism. I'm not a doctor, I'm just a mum that's been through this a lot, but these are different signs that don't indicate does your child definitely have autism or definitely not have autism from this sheet, but it's just something to make you think so that you can go into these meetings and things better equipped. And as we go through the episode, I'll explain why I've put that together. Anyway, you can go to mummyof4.com/100ASD. All the details will be found down in the description for you to grab that PDF. I'm also putting together a really helpful resource which you guys will have access to as soon as it is available. And if you pop your email address in when you go to that 100 ASD link that I talked about, then you'll be the first to hear about that as soon as it's ready. So William, our wonderful William, let me just kind of caveat this by saying that I have discussed with the children that I do discuss these things online. The reason I'm discussing the things that we've been through with the children's autism things online is to, first of all, support other parents and just to give us what I wish that I'd had and the stuff that I needed, the support and the help I needed and the information I needed and I found so difficult to access. So that's number one. But also just to kind of hopefully educate the world a little bit better about autism, what it is, what it isn't, the differences, because I think one of the big problems, and we will get to this, but one of the big problems you'll find as a parent when you're going through the autism assessment process is just how little education there is autism and how so many people don't really understand what it is. And I'm talking about myself, before Will was diagnosed, I knew so little about it. So my hope is by putting these videos out, then we can all be a little bit more educated about it. We can start conversations and just generally make the world a little bit of a kinder place. So hopefully these videos will not only be helpful to parents of children with autism, but if you ever feel like sending them to someone that you wish understood better, maybe in your real life, your child's teacher, whatever, then hopefully it'll be helpful for that too. So William, my wonderful William, who is currently 13, and while I don't necessarily share exact details of what's going on specifically with children now as they get older, I've talked to him, he's quite happy for me to discuss what happened back then when he was very little. It was very little when all this started, and he was going through this autism assessment process. So initially, when he was a very young child, as in a toddler and like an older baby, I suppose, He was initially a really good eater. Let's start there actually. He was initially, when we did baby-led weaning, he was the first of my children because our eldest is 7 years older. So the first of the children I did baby-led weaning with, it was all the rage. Everyone, all the baby yoga groups and everything was doing baby-led weaning, and I had the book and I was making all the, the bizarre, some of the recipes are downright bizarre, but he literally ate all of them. There were all these foods, and baby-led weaning is designed to introduce all these different foods to your child so that they don't become a fussy eater, and I thought this is great. And he was just eating everything I offered him. And then slowly, everything kind of narrowed until he became an incredibly fussy eater. He went from being a very good eater in that he ate so much variety, to narrowing down to literally having the same breakfast, the same lunch, and the same dinner every day. And that's all he'd eat. And he was incredibly rigid. And I know you get some eaters that will only eat certain foods and parents worry about the nutritional value and things. And I wasn't really worried about what he was getting nutritionally because he was eating a really balanced, healthy diet. So the things he was eating had all the things he needed in there. So the meal he had for dinner, for example, was this hidden chicken and veg pasta that I would make him. I'd have to make in these massive batches. So he was, getting all the vegetables. He was eating loads of fruit, and he had the same food at each meal. And he had strawberries as breakfast, and he had like bananas as lunch, and then I'd give him an orange with after his tea. And his diet was balanced. It was fine. But the difficulty was he would not deviate from it. So if we left the house, the only way we could get him to eat anything was to take food with us that he would eat, to the point where we'd go out for food and he would not eat anything. I was getting to the stage where I was like, would my child just please eat chips or pizza or chicken nuggets, just so that it's something I could buy him when we leave the house? Because it got to the stage where if we didn't leave the house, I was like, well, we've got to get home now or William's going to starve. And it may sound funny now, but it was a real problem, to the point where we went to south of France. We had a touring caravan at the time. I genuinely took food with me in the freezer for every day, the stuff that he ate at home, because I was really worried he just wouldn't eat anything. And we tried so many different things, feeding him different things, and he was just really, really rigid. So that was one thing. The eating just became really problematic, which I just like to, jump to the present day and say that, having gone through the whole autism assessment process and getting Will all the support, and he's just the poster child for early intervention, because now he is the best eater that I have. He will literally try anything, and if there is something weird and wonderful on the menu, he will pick it and he will try it. I'm so proud of that, because he just wouldn't eat anything, to the point where he wouldn't eat, he didn't want to eat ice cream or chocolate. I'm not saying it's bad, like everyone has, nobody has to eat that stuff, but he didn't even want to eat the treat stuff that most kids would love. We'd all be eating ice creams and he wouldn't want one. He fed all his advent calendar chocolates to my husband. He was really, really fussy with his food. Anyway, other struggles and signs then beyond the food. He had sort of funny little quirks. One of them being, at the time, and this didn't go on forever, but it went on for quite a while, he was absolutely terrified of wrapping paper, to the point where he felt like it was poisoning things. And this was when he was quite young. And if you wrapped a present and gave it to him, he hated it and was like, no. And he would not play with the thing that had come out of the wrapping paper, like it had been contaminated by the wrapping paper. So this went on for about a year, and then he did come out of it, and then he was unbothered by wrapping paper. But this was a really heightened and quite extreme reaction he was having. I guess the most obvious communication challenge, difficulty with hindsight, was the fact that he just didn't really want to speak to anybody, and he only really communicated with me. And while at the time I didn't really see it as a huge problem, because I knew intuitively, almost with hindsight, I think it was more intuition and reading him than him asking me for things, I always knew exactly what he needed. I was, I suppose, preempting his every need as his mum, because I was, at the time, I was home with him full time. And he was always fine as long as he was with me. He wasn't really melting down. His needs were met. He seemed happy. The way my husband seems happy, actually. Back then, William just seemed happy way down on the inside. He was not like super into like he wasn't a laughy, smiley child, perhaps the way he is now. He was more serious then. He was more of a serious child. He had times where he was laughing and things, but it wasn't generally with people. It was more because he was doing something that he found was funny. Back then, anyway. So he just didn't really want to communicate with anyone at all. And as long as he was with me, he was fine. And he was with me 99% of the time, so it wasn't too much of an issue. But I think looking back, his lack of wishing to communicate with anyone, it was almost like he was irritated by people. It was almost like, oh, you're too stupid for me to talk to, sort of attitude. And I guess one of the things that really was highlighted when he started school, bear in mind we live in Wales, and where we live, the children's school takes the children it was generally the day after the third birthday, but Will had an especially large year group, so it was a term after his third birthday. They did an intake, and they do something called Rising Threes. Excuse me, tickle the throat. They do something called Rising Threes nursery, which would be afternoon nursery, and then the school year in which they turn 4, they go into morning nursery, which is half days again, and it's within the school. I think this is not to be confused with nursery as in daycare, or which I think is what they have in England, but I think there's perhaps some subsidised childcare element, but in Wales it's actually just the nursery class is literally just a class that is within the school building, and it's part of the school. So he was in Rising Threes the term after he turned 3, and then morning nursery for that year after that. And luckily he had an amazing teacher who was very tuned in. And when we went for his sort of induction, like a taster, morning, afternoon, something, I just said to her very flippantly, I didn't know her at the time, know very, very well now, but I said to her very flippantly, oh, look, he's very bright, he can already read, and this is something I'm kind of getting to about spiky development. He can already read. And she's like, oh, we don't do that in nursery, because they're just learning the sounds and things. They don't call them letters, they call them sounds. I was like, no, he can read, because he could. Like at 3, he could read fluently in sentences without any bother. And I say, look, he can read, but if you think you're going to get him to wear shoes indoors, that's another one. He would not wear shoes indoors. He would not. He had a massive phobia of certain shoes. He hated having his feet measured, and he literally had to. Does everyone remember Doodles? They still do those. They're like little canvas shoes you get in Clark's in the UK. And he just had this pair of Doodles, and every time he needed bigger ones, I just end up saying, can you just bring me a larger size of those, please? And he just had these Doodles, and I was just dreading the stage where he grew out of these Doodles. It would literally be all year round, he'd just be wearing these Doodles, because that's all he'd consent to having on his feet without having a total meltdown. So I said to her, look, you're not going to get him to join in, you're not going to get him to sit on the carpet with the children, you're not going to get him to keep his shoes on indoors, but he can already read. And she's like, oh, okay. I said very flippantly, I'm pretty sure he's somewhere on the spectrum. So I can't remember at exactly what stage this occurred to me, but I know that although I wasn't in full acceptance of the fact that he probably had autism at this stage, the fact I was saying it flippantly, the fact that I was using that in my vocabulary, meant that I knew on some level that might have been something that we were dealing with. But I've got to say, I do not recall, and I don't know why, perhaps someone in my real life can remind me, I do not recall a specific moment where I learnt something or thought, oh, that could be relevant here. I know that my only experience of anyone in real life with autism up until that point that I can recall was back when I was in school. There was one boy who was several years younger, in a different school that just we knew through outside school, who needed round-the-clock care, and he eventually went to live in a full-time place that took care of people with autism. And that was the only experience I had of autism, and Will was nothing like that particular child. So I don't know at what stage I learnt more. I guess it was gradually, I guess it was over time. But I know that I made this flippant comment during his induction morning before he started school. Or maybe it was an afternoon, I don't know. But I made this flippant comment. Anyway, he started school. I was really worried about him going in. And he seemed fine. He just plodded on with it. Of course, they're only there for a couple of hours, and his teacher was amazing. Now, she did say to me a few weeks in, I think you might be right about the autism stuff. And yeah, I've got to say, I'm not super proud of how I reacted at this point. Now, she did say that I was the first parent not to totally lose their stuff. And normally, considering the types of parents I know to be in our school, I was surprised by this, but apparently so many parents get very angry when something like this is brought up. And maybe it was because I'd brought it up first. But when she brought this up to me, and this wasn't me making a flippant comment, it was a teacher saying it to me. My response was, I didn't say anything to her at the time, but I went away and I found all the evidence that it was wrong. So I went into denial. I spoke to our health visitor. I found all this evidence online, of he's not got autism, he's just gifted. Because I found all this evidence about how children that are gifted could display signs that are similar. So I got the health visitor out and I said, this sounds about right, doesn't it? And she said, yeah, okay. So I went back to the school and I said, right, I've spoken to the health visitor and she agrees with me. He's not got autism, he's just gifted. And she went to me, no, you were right the first time. And I kind of went, oh, and I let that land. And then I went into, okay, we've got to get this done mode. Then I flipped from denial mode into let's get this sorted mode. So at the time in Wales, I don't know if this was a county by county thing, a school trust by school trust, whatever, but at the time where we were living in Wales, children under the age of 5 were still under the health visitor. Children of school age go through a much slower, clunkier system, and I believe this to still be the case. And then obviously when you're 18, you're no longer in school, you're back to the NHS if you need any assessments or diagnoses. So I went to the health visitor, went back, and like, okay, we are going to need to push for this autism assessment. So we needed the health visitor to refer to get the assessment. And then I found out where the assessment was going to be, and I very, very politely, stalked is the wrong word, very, very politely contacted the secretary of the consultant that he was going to be under, and very politely, there is no reason to be anything other than polite because it's, being rude and pushy is never going to get you anywhere, but very politely just said, look, I'm really concerned. Is there any, any news on any updates on when they're going to be seen? When we, and I was polite but persistent. And one night then, it must have been late. So this poor secretary must have said to the consultant, will you just get this woman off my back? She's doing my head in. Because the consultant called me and had a chat with me, and then an appointment was set up from there. And during this call, she said, look, obviously I can't diagnose over the phone, I've not even met him, but from what you're saying, it does look like we're looking at autism. And I said on the phone to her, I said, look, about the food, I said, I don't know what to do. Like, should I just be going, this is your food, you'll eat it if you're hungry? He's so rigid with his food. Like, just give me a bit of guidance on this, because I know perhaps we'll have more indication after you've seen him, but I just need some guidance on this. And she said, look, if we're dealing with a neurotypical child, that would work. A healthy neurotypical child would not starve themselves. However, a child with autism might. So just, keep doing what you're doing. He's having a balanced diet, it's fine. Just keep plodding. So then we went through the actual autism assessment process. Now, we ended up having the assessment on 2 days that were back to back. So there'd been, I believe, a date before that where we'd had more like an interview thing where they'd asked me a lot of questions. I haven't got all of the details and the dates down as thoroughly and as accurately as with the girls, purely because I wasn't blogging and sort of noting everything down. I think I've got everything sort of a bit more accurately annotated down then with subsequent children, because it's just what I was doing for a living and sharing things on my blog and things. But anyway, this was, let me see, Bella was coming up to 1, I think, when Will was being assessed. So Will must have been coming up to 4. So, okay, so maybe the process with Will wasn't quite as long and drawn out as it felt. Perhaps the being persistent, politely persistent with the consultant secretary, I don't know, maybe the waiting list weren't as long back then. But I I can remember that it was Christmas when we went in for these back-to-back assessments. We'd had the interview where they collect lots of information and basically fill in forms. The forms had been sent to the school, I'd filled things in, and all this information gets pulled together about how the child is in different settings. And then there were two elements of the assessment. So there was the speech and language assessment and the social, let me get this right. The social communication clinic was the in-depth parental interview. Then there's a speech and language assessment and an ADOS assessment. So two of these were back to back on consecutive days because there had been some sort of cancellation and we'd been given those slots. And they were on the same days that he had his first Christmas concert. So it was something like he had a Christmas concert in the morning and then an assessment in the afternoon and then assessment again in the morning, then a Christmas concert again in the afternoon, something like that. It was really back to back. And I don't remember at the time thinking, I am so stressed. However, I came out with a rash all over my face. I basically looked like I'd been contouring my face with acid because I had like all across like my eye socket, all down my cheekbones with this bizarre like red sore. It was just so peculiar. It was the most bizarre thing. I hadn't changed anything about my skincare. I think it was just stress. I literally came out with this rash all over my face. And it had been this kind of, this worry and anxiety about the process, the dealing with a lot of judgment from people in our real lives at the time, the guilt for not having done it sooner, and just the worry of having gone through it all the first time. I was a bit of a mess, if I'm honest. And then we received the actual diagnosis. And as I've mentioned before on the podcast, I felt a bit, I guess, shell-shocked because I think it's like fight. And then, like when you get ill on the first day of your annual leave, just when you stop fighting, you get to the end of it, because I was worried that he wouldn't get assessed. I was worried he wouldn't meet the criteria for an assessment. I was worried that he did have autism, but they wouldn't see it in the assessment. I mean, the assessment was so thorough. I didn't need to worry about that. These people are so well trained at picking things up that I think if there's autism, they're probably going to see it. And they're definitely not going to misdiagnose a child without autism. So I needn't worry with that. But ultimately, I did feel quite shell-shocked. I can remember crying, which I guess is a partly release, partly grief, not because he had autism, but because I now had a list of things I knew he was going to struggle with, and parents don't normally get given that list. I did talk about this in a previous podcast episode in more depth if you kind of want to go into all that. But yeah, I felt just overwhelmed, I suppose. And then I kind of kicked back into doing mode again and which strategies we could put in place. We had some things that were helpful, some things that were not so helpful. So at the time you could apply for a statement for him in school, and they don't seem to be doing that anymore. It seems to be a new system, which I can't say I'm a fan of from a parent's point of view, because the support that Will's received through his statement has been great, and the system has been, let's just say, not so great with the girls, but that's a story for another day. So I went from like feeling really zoned out to clicking back into doing mode and let's get things sorted. And like I said, some things were less helpful than others. We did have one woman come to the house that was sent by the NHS, and she told me that I needed to prepare myself that he'd never be in mainstream school. And I think this is just a lesson that we need to remember, that we know our own children, and just as some people are like, oh, we don't see anything, we don't need to assess them in school, and you think, no, you're wrong. When this woman said this to me, I thought, no, you're wrong. And she was so wrong, because he is thriving in mainstream school. He has things in place, and we've always had things in place to support all of our children. And I'm not saying that all children with autism would thrive in mainstream school, but I knew in that moment that woman was wrong. And I'm glad that I trusted my gut then, just as I'm glad I trusted my gut and pushed for him to have an assessment and pushed for the others to have assessments, because, you know, as parents, I think we do have to listen to our guts. But then other things had been so helpful. So he had speech and language support. It's funny because I never thought of him having as speech and language difficulties because he could read so well, but I think it was more to do with the receptive language and the understanding and the use of language. So being able to read and being able to understand what you're reading, or being able to effectively understand what someone means when they're talking to you, or effectively communicate your wants and needs, is different, isn't it? So he had support with that a lot more so when he was younger. And honestly, such a poster child for early intervention, honestly. We had so many different strategies that were given to us, and I have got a whole playlist of videos about autism that I will link below for you to check those out, and some of those go through some of the strategies. But one of the ones that really sticks out in my mind was that same woman that there were two amazing women at the really top of the game that did Will's assessment, and one of the tips she gave me was to stop asking him questions. And if you watch early videos of me, I'm like, before all this, I was like, do you want to do this? And he'd just ignore me. And she said, stop asking questions. How am I supposed to do that? And she said, well, think of your thumb as a question, and then you make statements for every finger. So she's like, rather than saying, what do you want for lunch? Or what did you have for lunch? Then I'd have to say to him, I had a sandwich for lunch. And he'd be like, I had pizza for lunch. I mean, at that stage, he was not eating pizza. That came later when his food and eating improved. But just as an example, it's like modelling the language I wanted him to use rather than firing questions at him that he was like, I don't know what you want me to do with that. So we did have so much amazing support. I really went massively into research mode. I learned so much about autism, which ultimately led me to learning about the girls, which ultimately led me to learning about how girls with autism and boys with autism can so often present so differently. And Will was presenting at the time in a very typical, I guess, for boys with autism, in that I can see quite clearly, I couldn't see it as clearly at the time, but he wasn't making eye contact. He did not want to talk to people. You know, he was the most obvious that he has ever been with autism and his challenges, and the most obvious that any of the children had been at the time. Now, I would not say that his struggles are obvious at all. He is very confident and, like I say, poster child for early intervention. It doesn't mean he doesn't have autism anymore. It just means that everything we've put in place has just really helped him thrive. I really am so grateful that he was the child he was at 3. I mean, you know, he's still the same person, but he is so totally different as well. But if he hadn't been, how do we put this? Challenging, I guess. I've said this to him, if he hadn't been as challenging as he was at 3, wonderful, like adorable, so stinking adorable, but challenging, incredibly bright, but challenging. If he hadn't been as challenging as he'd been at 3, it wouldn't have pushed me to help to get him assessed. It wouldn't have then pushed me to learn so much about autism, and then the other children never would have had the understanding that they have now, which is part of the reason I'm now trying to, I guess, spread the word. That's not the right term, is it? Just share, I suppose. Share our experiences and share the stuff that I wish someone had told me. So again, more parents can know what to expect, know what to look for, and the world can just generally be a kinder place. Now, if you want to know a lot more about the actual ADOS and actual nitty-gritty of the assessment, there's a video on screen. Now, if you're listening on the podcast, you have to head to YouTube to watch that. Hang out with me a bit more inside of my Patreon. We've got an amazing community of parents in there with neurospicy kids, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.